I am Lucio Blanco P. to the third. I'm a research fellow with the Asia Pacific Pathways to Progress Foundation. I am very pleased to host and moderate this conversation this morning with a very distinguished expert who I personally know. Without further ado, let me first share some of the house rules before I introduce our speaker this morning. So kindly mute your audio during the event, and while somebody is speaking, you may unmute your audio if you wish to ask questions, or you may type in your questions in the Zoom chat box. And of course, this conversation would be recorded, and we would like to inform everyone this will be recorded. The copy of the recording shall be used for documentation purposes and will be retained by the Miriam College Institute of Global Affairs and Diplomacy. The Institute of Global Affairs and Diplomacy will not share the recording with any other individual or organization unless required by law. Only the Institute of Global Affairs and Diplomacy shall be permitted to access and download the recording. If you wish to request a copy, you may inform the Institute of Global Affairs and Diplomacy in writing. Any unauthorized downloading shall be dealt with in accordance with Miriam College Data Privacy Policy. The Data Privacy Act, it's IRR, related issuances and laws of the Republic of the Philippines. With those two basic house rules, let me now proceed with introducing our very distinguished speaker this morning. So we will have this morning Dr. Dennis Trinidad. He is a full professor at the International Studies Department of De La Salle University in Manila. He received his PhD in law from the University of Tsukuba in Japan. He is Master of Arts in Political Science from the University of Santo Tomas, and his Bachelor of Arts in Political Science from De La Salle University in Dasmariñas. Dr. Trinidad is a bemedaled scholar in this field. He had done a lot of research and went to several fellowships abroad and also here at home. He had served as a consultant and worked with various international aid agencies, including that of Japan, the Asian Development Bank, OSAID, for projects related to his fields of interest. He had written and published numerous works on the topic that he will share with us this morning. So without further ado, let me give the floor to Dr. Dennis Trinidad, my former, when I was a lecturer at De La Salle University at the International Studies Department, he was my department chair. And so it's very good to reconnect with you, Sir Dr. Trinidad. And we look forward to learning from your expertise in this field. So let me now give the floor to Dr. Dennis Trinidad. Sir, you have the floor.
Okay, thank you very much, Lucio. And I'm very happy to see you here. And as Lucio said, he was my former colleague at the International Studies Department. Let me just share my screen. All right, so thanks very much for that generous introduction again, Lucio. And I'd like to extend my gratitude to the organizers and specifically to Dr. Jed Urbena for inviting me and for giving me an opportunity to share my thoughts and insights on China and Japan foreign aid competition in the Philippines. So once again, a pleasant morning to all. I'd like to begin with a question. So why should we be concerned about great power competition, and why should we care about foreign aid competition in particular? Interstate competition is not new. the history of international relations is replete with great power rivalry. For centuries, nations have competed for various reasons. For example, during the age of exploration, we saw Spain and Portugal. France and Germany competed for dominance over continental Europe for many years. And the United States and the USSR rivalry during the Cold War. And in the age of globalization and interdependence, we have seen that strategic rivalries have persisted. According to William Thompson, a total of 174 strategic rivalries were in existence between 1816 and 1999. Rival nations are not necessarily great powers. There are competitions between middle powers and even between small states as well. Think, for instance, of rivalries like that of Iran and Iraq, Greece and Turkey, India, Pakistan, and Israel, Jordan. Rivalries between a major and a minor power also occurred. While strategic rivalries in the past were likely to end up in military conflict, I argue that rivalries in the 21st century is different. This is because nations in the age of globalization and interconnectedness are interdependent from each other, which thus makes the cost of actual conflict much higher. I will argue in this lecture that geoeconomics have become the norm in 21st century strategic rivalries. As I will elaborate later, the foreign aid competition between China and Japan can be framed using the concept of geoeconomics. Foreign aid competition has advantages and risks for recipient countries like the Philippines. For one, it can result to dependence and therefore to increased vulnerability from influence. On the other hand, competition can be a good thing because it prevents monopoly and provides recipient countries more access to cheaper development finance. My presentation is divided into 5 sections. I will begin the lecture with my argument, and then next I will discuss the nature of the Sino-Japanese competition in the Philippines. In the 3rd section, I will describe and analyze the aid strategies of Japan and China. The 4th section concerns about the competition in the Philippine infrastructure sector. And then finally, I will give my conclusion in the last part. Now, I argue that Sino-Japanese foreign aid competition in the Philippines is driven by economic and geopolitical imperatives. Although many scholars focus more on the geopolitical imperatives, I would argue that economic imperatives are also important drivers of this competition. In fact, market factors have made this competition inevitable. Foreign aid strategy is an important component of Chinese and Japanese national growth strategies. There's a growing demand for infrastructure finance in Asia due to economic growth of Asian economies. In the Philippines, the huge demand for infrastructure finance brought about by the Build program, coupled with our improved international credit rating and recent tax reforms, have led to high level of confidence among creditors and profitability of investments in the infrastructure sector. At the same time, the competition is also driven by the two nations' geopolitical interests in the Southeast Asian region. In the words of one scholar, Japan and China are like competing for friends. For Japan, it is necessary to retain its presence in the Philippines, to protect its interests here, including the stability of sea routes and waterways that are vital to Japan's trade. Japanese officials believe that there is linkage between the South China Sea dispute and its own dispute with China over the Senkaku Islands in the East China Sea. For China, foreign aid is essential to maintain good relations with a country that challenges its claim in the West Philippine Sea. Foreign aid is a flexible diplomatic tool that can be utilized to achieve economic and geopolitical aims at the same time. Both China and Japan succeeded in obtaining their diplomatic and economic objectives in the past through the use of foreign aid. For instance, in the 1960s, Japanese aid played a vital role in restoring diplomatic relations and in promoting Japanese exports in Southeast Asia. On the other hand, recipients of Chinese aid during this period supported mainland China's international recognition and voted to expel Taiwan in the United Nations. In the age of interconnectedness and globalization, foreign aid has become an important component of geoeconomics, defined as the use of economic instruments to produce beneficial political results. So my analysis of the competition in the area of foreign aid between Japan and China would be framed in terms of the concept of geoeconomics. I have identified at least 4 factors that explain the nature of Sino-Japanese competition in the Philippines. The first of these is attributed to the shift in Philippines-China policy. I argue in one of the papers I wrote that Philippine foreign policy is personalized in nature, meaning that the perceptions and attitude of the incumbent Philippine president is an important determinant of our foreign and security policy. This personalized foreign policy explains the continuity or discontinuity in our China policy. Having said this, the next Philippine president is vital to the continuity or discontinuity of our current China policy. So in other words, there is competition only when the president allows it, not only when the president has a pro-China orientation in his foreign policy. The second factor is China's economic rise. The volume of Chinese aid grew in proportion to the growth of the Chinese economy. As you can see in this graph, Japanese and Chinese aid are disproportionately denominated in loans and spent mainly on infrastructure sector. So because of this, competition with Japan is inevitable because the two countries focus their foreign assistance on a specific sector, which is infrastructure. The third factor is market and profit. As I've argued earlier, there's a huge demand for infrastructure finance in Asia in general, and in the Philippines in particular, due to the massive infrastructure project of the current administration. In a study conducted by the Asian Development Bank entitled Meeting Asia's Infrastructure Needs, ADB calculates that Asian countries must spend about $26 trillion or $1.7 trillion a year between 2016 and 2030 in order to meet Asia's demand for infrastructure. The high demand for infrastructure in Asia is also due to the rising national income and GDP growth in the last 2 decades. The graph on the left side of your screen shows that the pre-pandemic tax revenues across developing Asia have increased. This means that Asian countries have money to pay for their current and future debts. Economists argue that such improvement in revenue collection was a product of improved tax collection and economic deregulation, including investment and trade liberalization in the past 2 decades or so. As a result, the GDP growth outlook in the region was generally positive until the pandemic took place, starting last year. In our country, meanwhile, the high infrastructure demand is the effect of Duterte's Build, 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 a massive infrastructural project which aims to stimulate economic growth and to transform the Philippine economy. This massive infrastructure program costs about 8.1 trillion pesos, or about $180 million, to be financed through a mix of government revenues, PPP, or public-private partnership, bilateral and multilateral development assistance. It is also worth noting that based on their successful experience in the past, Japan and China have increasingly integrated their national growth strategies in their foreign policies. To contribute effectively to the goal of reviving the Japanese economy, the Abe government adopted a new charter on development cooperation in 2015 and introduced the export of infrastructure system and the concept of quality infrastructure to showcase Japanese superior technology and high-quality railways, dams, and road constructions, among others. Meanwhile, China's state-led economic growth and fiscal stimulus have finally reached its limit the country is now facing development challenges as it transitions from upper middle income to high income status. Although China is the second largest economy in the world, it is still classified as an upper middle income country under the World Bank country classification. This transitional problem is also called the middle income trap. China's economy has expanded through state-led industrial planning and fiscal stimulus. As benefits from fiscal stimulus reach its limits, the Chinese government must create demands for Chinese goods and services overseas and to enhance its international competitiveness in order to sustain economic growth. This is the context of the going out strategy, or why the going out strategy and the Belt and Road Initiative were adopted. The Belt and Road Initiative is expected to provide opportunities for Chinese suppliers and contractors. Japan and China pledged their support to Duterte's Build, Build, Build. In 2016, Beijing initially pledged $9 billion worth of assistance and investments to the Philippines. However, according to media reports, the volume of Chinese pledges reached $24 billion, but only about 4.7 billion was actually disbursed in the Philippines as of February 2021. Apparently, to counter Chinese pledges, in 2017, then Prime Minister Shinzo Abe pledged 1 trillion yen to build, build, build over the next 5 years. In July of this year, the outgoing Japanese Prime Minister Yoshihide Suga announced that Japan successfully fulfilled its 5-year commitment of 1 trillion yen to public and private financing. Finally, Sino-Japanese competition must also be viewed from the broader context of international security, particularly the emergence of great power rivalry between China and the United States. As you all very well know, China is now regarded as a challenger to US dominance in the region and was identified as a strategic competitor of the United States in its 2018 National Security Strategy. As a major US ally in Asia, Japan is expected to contribute to US policy of rebalance. Japan's aid activities is therefore vital to maintaining the system of regional alliance and containment of China's influence in Asia. So at this point, I'm going to proceed to the third part, or the third section of my presentation regarding aid policies and strategies of the two countries. So what are the aid strategies of Japan and China? Most observers relate this question to the establishment of Free and Open Indo-Pacific, or FOIP, and its rival Belt and Road Initiative. While it is true that these investment strategies define the geographic focus of Chinese and Japanese assistance, these areas are not exclusive. I argue here that Japan and China have utilized normative ideas in their foreign aid policies to make their respective aids attractive to prospective recipient countries. The normative ideas highlight some principles and values that developing nations deem important. In 2007, Japan launched the so-called values-oriented diplomacy, known at that time as the Arc of Freedom. Under this concept, Japan will provide assistance to countries that lie within the arc, that share universal values like democracy, rule of law, human rights, and market economy. These are values that China has difficulty realizing. I'm also going to point out later why Japan launched this values-oriented diplomacy only in 2017 later. Apparently, the goal of Japan's values-oriented diplomacy, as applied in its aid program, is to differentiate Japan's aid approach and modality with that of China's. The Abe government introduced another set of normative ideas with the introduction of the quality infrastructure concept, in which normative principles like efficiency, safety, resilience, sustainability, and contribution to economy and society of recipient countries as defining characteristics of a quality infrastructure. These characteristics are the exact opposite of China-assisted infrastructure projects, which have been criticized for inefficiency, damage to the environment, and low quality. Eventually, the FOIP, or the Free and Open Indo-Pacific, became the geographical focus of Japan's Partnership for Quality Infrastructure. Meanwhile, China has also used normative ideas to characterize its own aid programs and to make it more attractive and competitive. The Chinese government often alludes to the 8 principles of China's aid, which were first enunciated in 1964. Principles like win-win, equality, mutual benefit, and non-interference have become the trademark of Chinese assistance. Eventually, countries within the Belt and Road and Maritime Silk Road initiatives became the primary geographical focus of China's foreign aid programs in Asia. Japan has traditionally relied on these aid programs as a toolkit of its diplomacy since the reparations programs were signed. As I noted earlier in my argument, Japan utilized its aid to achieve diplomatic and economic goals in the 1960s and the 1970s. In 1980s, aid was used in conjunction with trade and investment to support Japanese industrial upgrading based on the flying geese model. In the 1990s and 2000s, aid was used to pursue a variety of purposes, including promotion of human security, peace building, environmental sustainability, and other international development goals. In 2010s, the goal of foreign aid was increasingly tied to Japan's national security goals. Programs like aid to enhance maritime capability was introduced during this period. China's rise as a major provider of foreign aid took place in such a very short period of time. By 2016, according to Kitano, China was already the 7th largest aid provider in the world, surpassing several traditional aid providers in the West. In this graph, you will see that China became a net provider of aid from being net receiver of aid. That year was in 2006. So this is the reason why Japan launched its values-oriented diplomacy in 2007, apparently as a response to the growing aid activities of China starting in 2006. So this means that from 2006 onwards, China became net provider of assistance. Prior to 2006, China was a net recipient of aid. It should be recalled that China used to be the largest recipient of Japanese ODA for several years. So it's not surprising why China is following the steps of Japan as a provider of assistance. In fact, there are many similarities among Asian aid donors, when it comes to approach and modality. But that is another topic for discussion. I also would like to highlight that recipient countries appreciate in particular the faster processing of China's assistance and its adherence to the no conditionality principle. Like Japan, China's assistance has been used to achieve specific diplomatic and economic goals in the past. Its main sectoral focus is infrastructure. As I have argued earlier, the Belt and Road Initiative, being a massive connectivity project, will stimulate demand for Chinese financing in Asia and provide opportunities for Chinese contractors and suppliers. We will now proceed to the 4th section of my presentation, and this is the actual foreign aid competition of the 2 countries in the Philippines. Japan's ODA to the Philippines is disproportionately denominated in loans, as the figure on the left shows, while its sectoral focus is infrastructure, as the figure on the right on your screen clearly indicates. Between 1965 and 2016, more than half of Japanese aid to the country was allocated for transportation, irrigation, and flood control. As of March 2020, Japan remains the largest source of foreign aid for the Philippines, followed by multilateral organizations, namely the Asian Development Bank and the World Bank. What is interesting in the graph is that we can observe that the AIIB, or the Asian Infrastructure and Investment Bank, is expanding its lending to the country. and has already surpassed traditional bilateral donors. As you can see in the graph, China is ranked 6th. The gap between Chinese and Japanese aid volume is obviously wide. So to those who are worried that we will become financially dependent on Chinese loans, the statistics show that it will not happen anytime soon. On the contrary, we have become heavily dependent on Japan financially over the years. Since the reparations period, Japan's ODA policy toward the Philippines has changed. Japan surpassed the United States as the country's largest provider of assistance in the 1970s. Takahashi mentioned that the growth of Japanese aid to the Philippines during this period was due to the US pressure, or what Takahashi termed as katagawari, which was part of Japan's response to US calls for burden sharing at that time. ODA volume since then had expanded further. In the 1990s, aid programs gradually diversified. New kinds of aid were introduced, such as environmental aid, support for democratization, and peace building. In the 2010s, aid is increasingly tied to Japan's economic revival strategy and security policy. Former Prime Minister Abe and President Duterte signed the Japan-Philippines Joint Statement on Bilateral Cooperation to implement the Japan's pledge of 1 trillion yen assistance over the next 5 years. The two countries agreed to cooperate in 9 major fields, including the sectors of infrastructure, energy, public safety, and agriculture. Perhaps the most important aspect of the agreement is the creation of a joint committee on infrastructure development and economic cooperation, composed of high-ranking officials from both sides. A JICA official commented that this is the first time that a committee was formed for the purpose of implementing and monitoring Japanese aid programs, in which the Office of the Prime Minister is directly involved. The table you are seeing now shows some of the projects financed under the 1 trillion yen pledge. As you can see, the projects are often large-scale and heavily focused on infrastructure and public works. One interesting project here is the Maritime Safety Capability and Improvement Project, in which Japan provided loan assistance to procure patrol boats for our Coast Guard. This is another first in the history of our aid relations with Japan. Note that the project is classified under infrastructure sector also. So among the projects that are very well known and large scale include the North-South Commuter Railway, which I assume many of you are familiar with. And then, of course, the Metro Manila Subway Project, Phase 1, which is expected to be completed in 2025. This is the Tubataha, by the way, and one of the patrol boats. It's one of the patrol boats that the Philippines procured under the Maritime Capability Improvement Project, which aims to enhance the country's ability to protect our national interest in the West Philippine Sea. The patrol boats were intended for the Philippine Coast Guard because Japan is prohibited by its laws to use ODA for military purposes. Now, what about Chinese assistance in the Philippines? To those who are familiar with the literature, China is technically not a new aid provider. It started its meager aid program during the early post-war period. It provided material assistance to communist revolutionaries in Vietnam and Korea in the 1950s. In the 1960s and the 1970s, China provided assistance to many sub-Saharan African countries. There is reason to believe that the Communist Party of the Philippines also received funding from China. After the Sino-Philippines diplomatic relation was restored, small-scale economic cooperation followed, including the $30 million procurement of 500 Mino hydropower plants in 1980. During the Macapagal Arroyo administration, several memoranda of understanding with China were signed. The North Rail project was started initially under Chinese financing, but was eventually canceled. The North Rail project was subsequently continued under Japanese ODA. The failed North Rail project and the cancellation of the National Broadband Network project, supposedly to be financed by Chinese financing, were considered or created a bad reputation, no, for Chinese financing in the country or in the Philippines. After the North Rail and the NBN projects, Chinese assistance to the Philippines fell. This is not surprising given that the successor of Macapagal Arroyo, the Aquino government, filed an arbitral proceedings against China in the Permanent Court of Arbitration that eventually invalidated China's claim in the West Philippine Sea. So this is what I meant about Philippine foreign policy being personalized. So Chinese assistance to the Philippines during the time of Noynoy Aquino was very nil, or it's very, very minimal. Now here are some lists of completed China assisted loans and grants in the Philippines. And despite what happened, there were a number of projects funded by Chinese loans and grants that were successfully completed. A number of these is agriculture related, such as the Agno River Integrated Irrigation Project, completed in 2013, and the Banawang Irrigation Project in 2008. Of course, there were also Chinese grants and humanitarian assistance, including the Philippine Science Center for Agricultural Technology, as well as mobile clinics or motor vehicles with diagnostic and treatment facilities that were donated to the Philippines, and some donations given to victims of Typhoon Haiyan. As I argued earlier, the continued presence of Chinese financing in the country would depend on the Philippine president's perception and attitude toward China. When President Duterte announced a China-oriented foreign policy during the first year of his presidency, the Chinese government was quick to respond. Xi and Duterte eventually signed 29 memoranda of understanding and other deals in 2018, which include cooperation on BRI, oil and gas development, and infrastructure over a period of 10 years. A total of 49 infrastructure projects to be financed or being considered for Chinese financing were drawn up by the end of 2018. However, as of February of this year, a total of 14 China-assisted projects are about to be completed or started. So the list includes the following. So there were many pledged projects, no, but only 14 China-assisted projects were either started or about to be completed. So one of these is the Binondo Intramuros Bridge. The Binondo Intramuros Bridge is expected to be completed this month and to be open to motorists in the first quarter of next year, if there will be no delays. This project is worth 3.39 billion pesos, funded through a Chinese grant. So for those who are not familiar, grants are kind of assistance that does not need repayment. Yes, no, we don't have to repay China, no, for the 3.39 billion. This project became controversial, however, because it will affect the buffer zone of the San Agustin Church, which is a World Heritage Site, and because the contractor was a Chinese company based in mainland China, the China Road and Bridge Corporation. Another project that is financed by Chinese financing is the Estrella Pantaleon Bridge, which links Makati and Mandaluyong. This project was also funded by a Chinese grant. So meaning the cost doesn't have to be repaid, no, by the Philippine government. One example of a more or less successful Chinese-funded technical cooperation project is the Philippine Sino Center for Agricultural Technology, which is now on its phase 3. This project is intended for Filipinos and Chinese counterparts to mutually learn from each other in terms of hybrid rice seeding, cultivation, and mechanical transplanting. China has also funded irrigation system in the country, such as the 4.37 billion pesos Chico River Pump Irrigation Project, which is expected to be completed by the end of this year. This project was funded by a Chinese soft loan. So for those who are not familiar, soft loan is a highly concessional loan from China's Exim Bank or Export-Import Bank. Upon completion, it is expected that about 4,350 families from Kalinga and Cagayan will benefit from the project. It will irrigate about 7,530 hectares of agricultural lands in the two provinces. China also agreed to construct the Kaliwa Dam, or what we call the New Centennial Water Source Project, which will serve as water supply for MWSS service areas, including the National Capital Region. So when completed, Metro Manila will not be dependent only on Angat Dam as its main supply of water. Currently, the project is still in the process of acquiring lots required for the tunnel outlet portal and consultation with stakeholders, including local government units of affected areas. Now, during this period of the pandemic, Japan and China also provided support to the Duterte administration's pandemic response through provision of financial assistance and grants. Japan pledged, for example, 100 billion yen assistance from its emergency and standby loans facility, namely the post-disaster standby loan and the crisis response emergency support loan. China, on the other hand, donated 1 million doses of Sinovac vaccines during the first quarter of 2021, and another 1 million doses of Sinopharm vaccines in August. Just in case you are wondering, the Asian Development Bank is the biggest source of financing for the Philippine vaccine procurement, not Japan or China. Now, these are some of the other highlights of the competition in terms of foreign aid by the two countries in the Philippines. So Japan has a longer history of aid relationship with the Philippines. And we can say that China is a newcomer as an aid provider to the country. And we can also see that China also focused on infrastructure sector. Japan has more contracted projects than China, obviously, based on the data that I've shown you earlier. However, China signs in terms of practice and management style of ODA. China signs memoranda of understanding first, and then allots assistance later. While on the other hand, Japan allots funds first or pledge funds first, and then negotiate for contracts. There were more delays in the China-funded projects than with the Japan-funded projects. So as I've noted earlier, these delays were actually caused by domestic factors, such as local opposition to Chinese funded projects. So after the NBN deal and the North Rail project during the time of President Macapagal Arroyo, the public became more circumspect of Chinese assistance, and they tend to ignore or just let the Japanese continue their infrastructure projects in the Philippines. So in conclusion, we can see that the competition in the area or in the field of foreign aid is due to a confluence of factors that I mentioned. It is very clear that geoeconomics will be a salient feature of strategic rivalry and competition in the 21st century. Again, because this is due to the interconnectedness and the highly interdependent nature of countries and economies in the global society today. Japan and China have sought to make their aid attractive by using normative ideas and the use of aid as a soft power tool to gain influence and geostrategic advantage. Now, as you can see also on the data that I've shown earlier, Japan is the largest provider of foreign aid in the Philippines. And this is because Japan has a long history of aid giving in the country. Japanese officials or aid officials have more familiarity with the Philippine aid management system. In fact, many of the Japanese aid officials have personal or close relationship with local officials in the Philippines. So they do not only conduct business, they also cultivate a relationship with their counterparts in the Philippines. Japan also has a strong track record and track record of being a reliable and credible partner in the infrastructure sector in the Philippines. China's career as aid provider in the Philippines is very recent and had a very bad beginning. This is because of the suspension and cancellation of the North Rail project and the National Broadband Network project. So there are also bad and erroneous perceptions about Chinese assistance, such as, for example, the Hambantota case, that the Chinese assistance is very expensive and it has very poor quality. So I suppose that China's project, particularly the two bridges that I mentioned earlier, would be a litmus test of China's foreign aid in the Philippines. So if the public could see that these projects are of quality, then that would be a good thing for China. It could mean that the Philippines would again avail of the Chinese financing for our infrastructure needs. So that ends my presentation. I look forward to your questions and comments later. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Trinidad, for those very insightful remarks. I'm sure our audience have benefited a lot from those fresh ideas and insights from someone who has really insider firsthand exposure on this topic. So before I open the floor for questions from the audience, again, I'd like to thank Ambassador Laura Del Rosario, Miriam College President and Dean of the School of Diplomacy. Thank you, ma'am, for joining us this morning. Our program coordinator for the BA Global Affairs and Diplomacy, Dr. Aaron Jedrabiana, thank you for inviting me to host and moderate this conversation. So since there are still no questions, let me ask my own question, sir, if I may.
Sure.
So the COVID-19 pandemic certainly affected the world in so many ways, and there's a lot of concern about its impact to development finance and aid going forward. And as you have presented this morning, China and Japan are two of the countries. One is the stable and enduring aid provider. One is a newcomer. And so, how do you think the pandemic would affect Chinese and Japanese foreign aid and infrastructure commitments abroad? Of course, specifically to the Philippines. Will we expect some disruption or continuity, but in a more modest scale? Your thoughts, sir.
Okay, thanks for that question, Lucio. Actually, the Chinese aid officials announced that they are going to continue their commitments in the Philippines, meaning that the ongoing projects will continue. However, I'm expecting that there would be some delays in the implementation of the projects. Likewise, the Japanese aid officials on the side of the Japanese government, they also pledged that they are going to continue infrastructure or the ongoing projects in the Philippines. But then again, as I've said, because of the constraint, in mobility and probably the supply of materials, there will be some delays. Now, the good thing about continuing these infrastructure projects is that it can contribute to economic stimulus. To those who are familiar, the government must spend in order to stimulate the economy. So this spending can be done through infrastructure. So as you can imagine, if the government spends for construction of a railway, it creates more demand for the market. So demand for steel, demand for contractors, demand for other materials used in the construction. So it stimulates the economy. So it's I think it would be a good strategy, a post-pandemic strategy, to stimulate the economy through public spending, particularly under this existing foreign aid funded projects of China and Japan in the Philippines. So I think this is also true, in other countries, in other recipient countries of Japanese and Chinese financial assistance.
Okay, thank you, sir. So we have a question from Ms. Dayan Tam. So despite of the track record of Japan in providing aid to the Philippines, what is the main reason why President Duterte, the incumbent administration, persist in choosing China? I think the question is that why still engage China? Because it appears that, as you said, President Duterte, this administration, engages both China and Japan for infrastructure projects in the country. But why, despite of the more established seasoned track record of Japan, the quality that you mentioned earlier, why is there still a need for the Philippines to pursue engagement with China in the infrastructure space?
Okay, that's a very good observation, Dan. Actually, you're right. We can have those infrastructure projects even without approaching China, to finance some of them. However, as I've pointed out in my discussion, we have been dependent heavily on Japanese financing, and it would be good, if we can diversify our source of financing. Of course, that's not the primary reason why Duterte invited the Chinese government to finance some of those infrastructure projects. So one reason is his personal attitude towards China. So as I've said, our foreign policy is highly personalized, and it's determined really by the attitude of the incumbent Philippine president. So it's just so happened that President Duterte President Duterte's attitude towards China is positive, and he considers China as a potential provider of assistance. And besides, the amount of money that is needed for the Build program is so vast that no bilateral partner can provide all of them. So the more players contribute to the financing source, the better for the Philippines. And as I've said, market-wise, when there is competition, the players also try to make their services competitive, and improve on their quality. Okay, that's the good thing about competition. So it's typically like in a market. So when there are two players selling the same product, so the tendency for the players is to be competitive. So this is the invisible hand that Adam Smith talk about in his book, The Wealth of Nations. And because of the competition, we are given choices. Okay, and not only choices, but we also have more access to cheaper capital. So when two players are competing for financing as a source of financing, they tend to also lower the cost, no, of this financing to make their financing more competitive, no, and attractive, no, as I mentioned in my presentation.
Sir, we have a follow-up question related also to that from Dr. Rabena. So you laid out the track record of both countries, China and Japan, in terms of funding infrastructure projects in the Philippines. There's a lot of interest about the pros and cons of engaging either or both, and in terms of the conditionalities and the terms that are attached to the loan or the grants that they finance. Um, what are your thoughts about the pros and cons of the conditionalities offered by China vis-a-vis Japan?
Okay, the good thing is that well, I've done some studies comparing Western and Asian donors, and one of the characteristics of foreign aid, no, provided by Asian donors is that they tend not to interfere in the domestic affairs of the recipient country, and that is also true, no, in the case of Japan. Although Japan is a member of the OECD, there is hesitancy on the part of the Japanese government to impose conditions on its recipient countries. So on that note, Japan and China, and we can also add South Korea as kind of aid providers that really do not impose conditions. Now, if you're thinking that China would use its aid, no, to explicitly change, no, our position in the South China Sea, I don't think China will do that. No? So foreign aid, no, as a soft power instrument does not come with explicit, okay, or specific national interest, no, that's being advanced, no, by the provider, no, by the providing country. Okay, it's always hidden. No, it's always hidden. Of course, it's up to us. No, if we are going to let China, no, claim most of the West Philippine Sea, no, but it's not something that is explicit, no, in the negotiation. It's not discussed, no, even discussed in the aid negotiation. Okay, that we will give you this, and then you allow us not to fish in the. There's no discussion, no, of that, no, in the aid negotiation, and it will not be tackled even, no, by the officials involved, no, in the negotiation. But then again, the key here is the normative ideas, no, the normative ideas that I mentioned earlier. China is advancing some normative ideas like win-win condition, no conditionality, and no interference. And on the other hand, Japan is also advancing, no, some normative values, no, like universal values, democracy, rule of law, and so on. No? So the key is which of these normative ideas are valuable, no, to the Philippines. But then again, the competition allows the Philippines not to access both, no, financing, no, from Japan and China. Okay.
Sir, you touched earlier about the personal dimension in Philippine foreign policy and how that affects relations by the Philippines with China, the improved ties under the present administration, and also the linkage between the West Philippine Sea, the maritime issue, with that of aid. There is some concern that Chinese foreign aid may be affected by the temperature in the South China Sea or the West Philippine Sea. If it becomes more, if the frictions or the tensions and the incidents continue to affect relations, then do you see a possible impact of that on aid? And a related question is, Do you sense a concern on the part of Japan about the Philippines and China becoming too close? And do you think that may affect Tokyo's decision to withhold aid or withheld some investments, and hope that a better, a new administration next year may be better?
Okay, that's a very good point, Lucio. Thanks very much, no, for that question. Now, regarding the issue of how the South China Sea or the maritime dispute with China could possibly affect our aid relations with China. Well, I suppose that is one reason why public opposition is very strong, no, against Chinese assistance. It's very clear, no, that the public's perception of Chinese aid is influenced by the existing maritime dispute, no, with China. And I suppose this is the reason why the public is more circumspect of Chinese financing. They scrutinize more, in other words, Chinese assistance than Japanese assistance because of that possibility. No? Because there is a perception that China might use explicitly, no, its assistance in order to get what it wants, no, or to strengthen its claims, no, over the West Philippine Sea. So on the other hand, you mentioned regarding the question about whether Japan, no, would what is Japan, no, feeling about the Philippines and China being becoming more close, no, because of the Duterte administration. Well, we've seen that, no, that when if you would recall, when Duterte visited Beijing, when he announced, no, that he is moving closer, no, to China, that he is adopting, no, a pro-China foreign policy. The government of Japan, no, many Japanese officials asked their counterparts in the Philippines, so what does that mean? No? They were asked to explain what President Duterte meant, no, by that, no, that it's withdrawing its ties with the United States and so on. So there was an immediate response, no, from Tokyo regarding those remarks, no, that President Duterte made, no, when he visited the People's Republic of China. And will Japan withhold the assistance if the Philippines becomes more close to China? I don't think so, because that would only strengthen further, no, or that would only pull or push the Philippines, no, towards China further. Okay, so Japan had to maintain its aid relations with the Philippines, strengthen its enhance its relationship with the Philippines, continue to provide steady stream of assistance in order to prevent the Philippines from moving more closely, no, towards the Chinese orbit. So it's not an option, no, for Japan, no, to reduce, no, its assistance. On the other hand, the more the Philippines becomes close to China, the more that Japan will be more proactive, no, to win the Philippines back. Okay, and that means also, no, providing additional assistance for the Philippines.
Sir, a follow-up question about the COVID-19 pandemic. As we know, the variants like the Delta are threatening some initial success that we had other neighbors had in terms of trying to deal with this coronavirus pandemic. And also there's a need to try to fuel economic recovery, try to balance, competing demands between public health and the economy. And in this from this vantage point, do you see China and Japan possibly shifting their funding priorities, maybe away from hard infrastructure into more public health or epidemic response, or maybe stimulus for small businesses?
I don't think so. Okay, Japan and China will provide assistance not to health, not to social welfare, but it will not change the priority. The main priority will still be infrastructure. So the main reason for this is the market nature, of Japanese and Chinese assistance. Japan Japanese assistance is primarily denominated in loans. So I mentioned that, I presented that in my lecture earlier. And Japan had to repay the investors. In other words, the money that's being used for loan assistance must be repaid, or else it will not continue. It will not continue. And there are Japanese investors that's financing the loan assistance. Okay. In contrast to Western donors from the West usually provide more grants than loans, and their aid program is usually financed by their national budget, so they can afford not to give grants rather than loans. But in the case of Japan and China, for example, the one that was provided by the Exim Bank, okay, the Export-Import Bank of China, the interest and the principal must be returned eventually, so that the Chinese Exim Bank can also make the lending practice profitable for investors. Okay, so this is the market aspect of Japanese and Chinese assistance, which is different, or substantially different from the Western development assistance.
Sir, I think we are down to our final question. So former Prime Minister Shinzo Abe is one of Japan's longest serving prime ministers. And there's a lot of comparison between him and President Xi Jinping in terms of the length of service that they had to their country. And I think there's a lot of expectations that President Xi Jinping will exceed most of the terms of past Chinese leaders before Deng Xiaoping. And of course, Prime Minister Shinzo Abe is credited for reinvigorating Japan's aid and development finance, infrastructure projects, investments overseas. Came up with such initiatives as the Partnership for Quality Infrastructure, and worked with partners like US and Australia with the Blue Dot Network, as well as the Economic Prosperity Network. Now, the one who replaced him, Prime Minister Yoshihide Suga, resigned with just barely a year in office. And while Suga was seen as like a successor that will most likely continue his predecessor's policies, now with him resigning, there's a lot of questions as to whether there will be a continuity in Japan's foreign aid policy. Your comments on this, sir?
Okay. Of course, I'm expecting that the Liberal Democratic Party would win in the next general election. And if that is so, then I'm expecting that there will be continuity in Japanese aid policy. And in most of the foreign policies, I suppose. There's been a change in Japanese politics in the past few decades. The opposition parties that are competing for during elections are all conservative political parties with almost similar views regarding security and economic policies. So actually, whichever political party wins in the next general election, not even the Liberal Democratic Party, there will be a continuity. Because as I've said, the policy postures are the same. The Socialist Party has lost its credibility as an opposition party, and it will be difficult for the left in the political spectrum, no, in Japanese politics, no, to return, no, to its previous heyday, no, in the 1960s or in the 1970s. So we're expecting that conservative parties will rule Japan in the next decades, no, I suppose, because the competing parties are all conservative, and with that, no, I'm expecting that there will be continuity, no, in most of their security and economic policies.
Thank you so much, Dr. Trinidad, for generously sharing your time with us this morning. Maraming salamat. At this point, let me call our good Ambassador Lula Del Rosario to give the closing remarks. Ma'am, the floor is yours po. Uh, Good morning po, Ambassador Del Rosario. Um, Nakamute po kayo.
Okay, yeah, yes, I'm reading the I'm reading the chat. Okay, thank
Okay.
you. Yeah.
We would like to invite you po to give the closing remarks.
Okay. All right. Thank you. Thank you very much. I'm very grateful for your presentation, Dennis, and I'm glad you pointed this out because you know there are certain apprehensions in some segments of our society about our foreign economic policy, so to speak. Okay. But I wanted to give this background to others before Dennis started. Actually, the initiative of China was formally launched in 2013, on 8 years ago, when they hosted APEC. And I think it was known as the Belt and Road Initiative. And in that initial plan, the Philippines was not part of that, if you look at the original map. And at the same time, they initiated this because they wanted really to be a counter force to Japan, because Japan, as everybody knows, leads Asian Development Bank. The president of ADB is always a Japanese because the biggest donor is the Japanese government. And so China wanted to have a bigger influence. And it formed its own Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, or the AIIB. Now, this AIIB, of course, it invited members, and the Philippines was one of the last ones to become a member. And this AIIB is supposed to take care of this part of the BRI initiative. So that at least you know, there's also competition to ADB, so the Chinese AIIB. And then, of course, and at that time, the US could not do much except maybe to campaign and say, ask for transparency, ask for governance in the way the bank is run, which is true. And I think you all know that 3 years ago, I think, as many countries in Africa and Asia were entering into infrastructure projects with Chinese. Correct me, Dennis, if I'm right or not. Isn't it Prime Minister Mahathir of Malaysia called attention to that fact, right? And he said that the terms were not well, for him, they were not transparent enough. And in some cases in Africa, there were some, how shall I call it? There were some manipulation. So maybe you can also answer this as I'm saying goodbye and thank you to them. And of course, talking about this, we have to understand that based on Professor Dennis's presentation, both countries really were using what we call statecraft. You know, these are tools to gain influence among partners, and also not only that, to gain some, not just influence, certain control in certain aspects. Now, why did Japan and China choose infrastructure? Well, because of the big needs, as mentioned by Professor Dennis, and also because people at that time, in 2012, 2013, they were already talking about connectivity. And the number one issue, of course, if you want to create progress and development in a particular region, you have to connect them somehow, by land, by air, by sea. So the connectivity was meant to address movement of goods, movement of people, movement of services. So this would mean also infrastructure in energy, infrastructure in the ITC. At any rate, I'm sorry, I'm making this comment now. I would have wanted to make comment earlier, but I want to thank all of you, Lucio and Dennis, for bringing this to Miriam College and for bringing your expertise and your discussions on this area to us this morning. So I wish to thank everybody who joined us today at Miriam, and as we move along in the development of our own involvement in our own economic, foreign policy, and also political policy, we shall be bringing you more discussions of this kind. Okay, thank you very much. Okay, anyway, Dennis, do you
Thank
want to
you.
comment what I said as a last comment? Thank you very much, and
Yeah,
I wish,
thank you.
of course, our students, of course, who are here. And all our friends from other schools, from other policy think tanks. Thank you for joining us. Okay, good morning. Okay.
Dr. Trinidad, you may respond if
Yeah, yes,
okay.
connectivity is one factor, no, that drive Japanese and Chinese focus on infrastructure. But we have to take note, no, that even prior to the connectivity project, the ASEAN connectivity project, Japan was already into infrastructure. And China was also already in infrastructure even in the 1970s when it was providing assistance to sub-Saharan African countries. Okay, so perhaps connectivity added, no, to the demand, no, and that is good for Japan, both Japan and China, not to respond not to this high demand, no, for infrastructure. It created no additional demand, in other words, yung connectivity, ASEAN connectivity. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Trinidad. Thank you, Ambassador Del Rosario, for the insightful comments. This brings our conversation this morning to a close. Thank you, everyone, for joining the fourth diplomatic hour. And we look forward to seeing you again in the next round of conversation. Thank you and have a great day.
Thank you, everybody.
Okay.
Thank you and goodbye.
Thank you, Lucio. Thank you.
Sir Dennis, thank you so much po, sir.
Thank you, Jed.